This enables the computer to perform more and it will help to upgrade the performance of a computer system. If I want to communicate with the peripheral devices of a computer system into the motherboard, at that time I must have this kind of slots. So there are two types of RAM slot, that is single inline memory module and dual inline memory module. So it is a controller, it's a circuit that enables the CPU to communicate with hard disk or floppy disk. Hello everyone, myself Rohini TS, Computer Science Faculty, Vidhyaashram Pre-University College, Mysore. Yeah. So in last session we had a discussion regarding components of a motherboard, right? So there we had a first component. What is that? That is CPU. That is also known as what? Processor. Yes. So in last session we learned about CPU. After that we had a discussion regarding BIOS, that is BIOS, Basic Input Output System. After that we had a discussion regarding CMOS, that is complementary metal oxide semiconductor, right? So in this session I will be continuing the further components of a motherboard. So in this session I will be discussing on the next component of a motherboard. Yes, what is the next component of a motherboard? There I have what? Slots and disk controller. Okay, so in this session I will be discussing regarding the slots and disk controller. So in this session I will be discussing regarding slots and disk controller. So now we'll see what do you mean by slots and what are all the types of slots and why we require these slots. So coming to the slot, what do you mean by slot then? It is an opening in a computer system that is mainly used to insert PCB. What do you mean by PCB then? That is printed circuit board. Yes, that is nothing but what? Motherboard, right? So this slot is the space, that is the opening space in a computer system that is mainly used to insert an motherboard into the computer system. So slots are also known as what? Expansion slots. Why we call this as a expansion slots? Because it allows or helps to improve the performance of a computer. It will by using these slots we can upgrade the performance of a computer system. That's why slot is also known as what? Expansion slots. So this enables the computer to perform more and it will help to upgrade the performance of a computer system, and it also upgrades the facilities. By making use of these slots, it helps to improve the performance of a computer system. So that this is also known as what? Expansion slots. So there are several types of slots. So for various purposes, we are going to use several kinds of slots. So in these slots, you have to concentrate on expansions. For a particular type of slots, you have to concentrate on its expansions or abbreviations. This is very important for 1 marks questions. So or else you can also expect what do you mean by slot and mention 2 or more slots. That kind of question is also very important for 3 marks question. Anyway, you will be getting 1 question from this chapter, 1 marks 1 question and 3 marks 1 question. For that you have to consider this slot concept also. So let me get into this slot. So there are several types of slots for various purposes. Then what is the first type of slots that I have here? That is ISA slot. Then what do you mean by this ISA? So abbreviations or expansion of that ISA is nothing but what? Industry Standard Architecture. So students, here you have to concentrate why we require this kind of slots. So various slots will going to perform a particular task that you have to concentrate. So this ISA slot is mainly used to connect a modem and input devices. It can be either what? Keyboard, mouse or any other input devices, or if you want to insert modem into your computer system, at that time you have to go with this ISA slot. That means what? Your motherboard must has this kind of slots in that. So that is regarding ISA slots, and also you can see the image of this ISA slots here. So while looking into the motherboard, you can see these kind of slots which is mainly used to add or mainly used to insert a modem and input devices into the computer system. Yes, let me move on to the next slot. So what is the next slot that I have? So here I have PCI, that is Peripheral Component Interconnect. So what do you mean by peripheral? Can you recall the first session of your first chapter? What do you mean by peripheral then? So it consists of what? Input unit, output unit along with the secondary storage memory, right? That is known as what? Peripheral unit. If I want to insert or if I want to communicate with the peripheral devices of a computer system into the motherboard, at that time I must have this kind of slots. So that is PCI. So PCI slots are mainly used to connect a graphics accelerated cards. So this is mainly used for what? Visual purpose. And then I have what? Sound card and internal modems, then SCSI cards. So in order to include all these cards or in all these components into the motherboard, then I must have this PCI slot, that is peripheral component interconnect. So here you can see the image of peripheral component interconnect. So this is mainly used to add or mainly used to communicate with the sound cards or what? Accelerated, graphics accelerated cards and then modems or any other devices. So here you can see the image of this PCI. Let me get into the next slot. And here you have to consider one thing. So these PCI slots are much faster than ISA cards. Even ISA cards perform the same operations like PCI, right? So there, with the help of that ISA cards, I can interact with or I can add input devices, right? In the same way, I can also add or I can insert input devices with the help of this PCI cards or PCI slots. But these PCI slots are much more faster than the ISA slots. Okay, that you have to keep it in mind. And then, what is the next slot that I have here? So that is AGP. What do you mean by this AGP? That is accelerated graphic port. Keep it in mind, that is accelerated graphic port. So why we require this kind of slots? As the name indicates, it is a graphic card. So why we require these graphic cards? So mainly to improve the video quality. So in this generation, students or many of the children are very fond of what? Video games and PUBG like that, right? So in order to improve the quality of a video, there we need this kind of slots. So it mainly improves the visual quality of a system. So AGP slots is an advanced port which is designed for mainly for the video cards and 3D accelerators. And also we have what? Virtual reality, right? So for that kind of things, at that time we require this AGP slot. So AGP slot is nothing but what? Accelerated graphic port, right? That is mainly to improve the video quality, which will be used in the video games mainly. For that kind of things, we are going to use this AGP slots. So here you can see the image of AGP slots. So this is PCI slot and it is AGP slot. So we'll move on to the next slot. So that is RAM slot. What do you mean by RAM? I already told you that once we are going to give the input to the computer system, then that input unit will be going to give that data or instructions into the processor. That is nothing but what? CPU, right? That processor or CPU will going to process the data. Once it is processed, then that must be stored in some storage unit, right? For the memory, we require this RAM slot. That is mainly to use or mainly to store the data and instructions which is immediately required for the processing. As I told earlier, if you want to execute anything or if you want to execute any data or instruction, that must be in the primary memory, right? If it is in the secondary memory, then that must be bring back to the primary memory. Then only that CPU can access the data and instructions which is resides in the primary memory. Right? For that purpose, we require memory, right? So that in order to store the data or instructions or any process data which needs to be submitted or to transfer into the display units or for the memory or for further processing, that must be in what? Memory devices. So in order to store any data and instructions, we require memory. For that purpose, we are going to have this RAM slot in our motherboard. Then what do you mean by RAM here? That is random access memory. It is a type of volatile memory. That means what? I will be coming in the further sessions. So stay tuned. So coming to this RAM slot, so RAM slot is mainly used to install the memory. As I told, memory is mainly required for what? In order to store the data and instructions which is required for processing, right? So this RAM slot is mainly used to install the memory, that is used to store the programs or any data which is currently required by the CPU. So that we require this RAM slot. Then, how we are going to measure the size of this RAM? So, this RAM is measured in terms of bytes. What do you mean by bytes then? Already you guys know that, right? So, in first PUC, you guys had a discussion regarding what do you mean by bit, byte, right? So, bit can be 0 or 1. A bit can be either 0 or 1. So, group of 8 bits is known as what? Byte. So that with the help of that byte unit, we are going to measure this RAM. So, and there are two types of RAM slot. So, based on our requirement, we have to choose whether I require what? Single inline memory modules or dual inline memory module. So, there are two types of RAM slot, that is single inline memory module and dual inline memory module. So, coming to this RAM slot, here you can see the image of RAM slot. Why we require RAM slot? It is mainly used to install the memory. That memory is used to store the data and instruction. It will be holding the data and instruction which is further required for the processing. So, there are two kinds of RAM slot, SIMM and DIMM. Keep it in mind. So, moving to the next kind of slot. So, what is this? Processor slot. So, the next kind of slot is what? Processor slot. Why we require this kind of processor slot? So, processor is nothing but what? CPU, right? So, this processor slot is mainly used to insert the processor chip. So, without processor chip, we cannot do anything, right? So, without CPU, we cannot do anything because a main computation part or computation engine which is resides in CPU itself. So that this processor slot is very important. So, in order to insert that processor chip into the motherboard, then I require this processor slot. And you can see that it is the largest chip which is resides on the motherboard. We also have another slots or chips, but when comparing all the components, this processor slot or a processor chip is the largest chip in the motherboard. And also you can see the image of this processor chip. Here you can see this one. So this is nothing but what? Processor slot, where I am going to insert the processor chip in that particular slot. And already you guys know about processor, why it is required and what are the subcomponents which is resides in that particular type of processor, right? So that's why we require this processor slot. Let me move on to the next slot, that is PCI Express slot. So what is this PCI Express slot? Already you guys had a discussion regarding this PCI slot, right? So here I have discussed about this PCI slot. Why we require this one? In order to communicate or in order to have an interface between the peripheral components into the computer system, right? Then what is this PCI Express slot? It is an extended version or upgrade version of that PCI slot. So this PCI Express slot is an upgrade version of a PCI slot, and it is much more faster than the PCI slot. Okay, that's why it is an upgraded version. And you have to remember, PCI slot will going to have a data in a parallel manner. But in this PCI slot or PCI Express slot, there it will going to have a data in a serial manner. That means what? The PCI slot is capable to include or capable to transfer 1 byte of data at a time. That is known as what? PCI slot, which applies or which works based on the parallel manners. But coming to this PCI Express slot, so it works based on the serial model. That means it has a capability to transfer 1 bit of data at a time. So this PCI slot has a faster bus architecture than AGP and PCI buses. So what is this AGP? So already we had a discussion, right? So AGP slots are nothing but what? Mainly used for the video configuration or in order to improve the quality of a video. And then that PCI slots are mainly used to include what? Peripheral component of a computer to the computer system, right? So, but this PCI Express slot is more faster than much faster than this AGP and PCI buses. So this is regarding this PCI Express. Here you can see the image of this PCI Express slots. So here I am going to communicate or I am going to what? Install PCI, that is what peripheral components into the computer system. So that we require this PCI Express slot. So moving on to the next slot, that is last, PC card. So PC card is nothing but what? Personal computer card. So this is mainly used in the laptop computers. So in laptop computers mainly we are going to use this kind of PC card. So mainly it is used in the laptop computers and it includes Wi-Fi card, network card and external modem. If I want to insert what? Wi-Fi or if I want to connect with networking card and then with what that external modem, at that time my system must have this kind of slots. That is what? PC card, personal computer cards, that is mainly used in the laptop computer. I hope you all understood with this slot concept. So let me brief it out. So coming to these slots, you can expect this question for 3 marks. Okay, so it is important for 3 marks. So what do you mean by this slot? It is an opening space where we are going to insert a motherboard, right? So there we have several types of slots. Based on our requirement, we have to choose this kind of slots or by default there will be some slots in our motherboard. So coming to this ISA, it is mainly used to connect input devices into the computer system, and then PCI slot, that is peripheral component interconnect, mainly used to connect or to interact with the peripheral components, that is input output devices along with a memory. Okay, mainly that includes sound card and video card, then SCSI cards, and they are much faster than that ISA cards. And coming to this AGP, it is mainly to improve the quality of a video, mainly used in gaming purpose or in virtual reality, that is in the 3D accelerators. It acts as what? It is used in the 3D accelerators and mainly used in the video cards. That is regarding AGP. And coming to this RAM slots, so mainly used to install the memory into the computer system. Okay, there we have two types, SIMM and DIMM. That is what you mean by that. Single inline memory module, then dual inline memory module. After that, there I have what? Processor slot, mainly to insert a processor chip into the computer system or to the motherboard. So it is the largest chip on the motherboard. Here you can see the image of that processor slot. After that, we had what? This PCI Express slot. An extended version of that PCI slot. It is much faster and it is mainly used to interconnect with the peripheral component. So at last there we have what? PC card, personal computer card, that is mainly used in the laptop computers. So there with the help of that I can have a communication with Wi-Fi card and then modem, external modem along with a network. Yes, it's all regarding the slots. So in this we concentrate regarding the expansions or abbreviation of each kind of slots. Yes, we'll move on to the next concept or next component of a motherboard. What is that? Disk controller. Okay, so what do you mean by disk controller and what are all the disk controller we have? Okay, so we'll see now. What do you mean by this disk controller? It is a circuit. So mainly this disk controller is a circuit that enables the CPU to communicate with a hard disk and floppy disk. Okay, if I want to communicate with a hard disk and floppy disk, then I require this disk controller. Let me write one thing. So consider this as a system bus. Here I have processor or CPU. So what I have here? Processor or CPU. After that, here I have memory. And let me take one thing, that is disk controller. So consider a line which is nothing but what? System bus. What is this, ma'am? This system bus and all. So I will be discussing in the next session. So mainly this system bus is used to connect to the input-output system or input-output unit into the computer system. Okay, that's why I require this kind of system bus. After that, here I have what? Processor or CPU, and here I have memory. What's there in memory? So this memory will going to hold the data and instructions which is required for processing, right? And this processor or CPU, what is the working procedure of this CPU? It is mainly used for the computation part, right? So there we have ALU, registers, and what? CU. Already you guys know about the CPU and the processor, both are same. So after this I have disk controller. So this disk controller may comprises of what? Hard disk drives or floppy disk drives. So let me see one thing. So here we have a system bus and we have processor or CPU, then a memory. So memory is used to store the data and instructions. So with the help of this system bus, okay, it will going to create or it acts as what? Interface between the CPU memory along with the disk controller. So what do you mean by disk controller then? It is a circuit that enables the CPU to communicate with hard disk and floppy disk. So hard disk and floppy disk are the secondary storage devices. There I can store my data and instruction permanently. But what if I want to communicate with that kind of hard disk or floppy disk? Then there must be some interface. So that interface is nothing but disk controller. Getting, students? So if I want to communicate with hard disk or floppy disk, there will be some data and instructions or any other data or information will be there in the floppy disk and hard disk, right? So if I want to communicate with that, okay, processor has to communicate with floppy disk and hard disk. Why? There is a data and instructions which is required for processing. So that I require disk controller. That disk controller will act as an interface between the CPU and hard disk or a floppy disk. So coming to this disk controller, it is a device that will going to connect a disk drive to the computer bus, which is mainly to enable the data transfer between the various components of a computer system. So there will be two kinds of operations, read and write. That is nothing but what? Data transfer. So in order to exchange the data or information, then we require this disk controller. So it is a controller, it's a circuit that enables the CPU to communicate with hard disk or floppy disk or any other kind of disk. So let me see what do you mean by this hard disk and floppy disk. So coming to this hard disk controller, as the name indicates, controller is nothing but what? There will be some controlling things. So there will be some standards that has to be followed. So it controls and coordinates the data transfer between a computer system with this hard disk. So we'll see the points regarding this hard disk controller. It is an interface. So if it is an interface in the sense that you have to remember there will be some medium between the computer system and hard disk drive. So HDC or hard disk controller is an interface that enables the computers to read and write the information to the hard disk drive. So let me tell you one thing. Consider this as what? Hard disk drive. So consider this as hard disk drive. So there will be some data and instructions. So as I told in the previous slide, so here you can see that there will be a disk controller. In that disk controller, there we have hard disk drive along with a floppy disk drive. So there will be some interface, that is what? System bus. If I want to access the data from CPU or memory, then I have to interact with this disk controller. So that coming to this hard disk controller, it acts as what? Interface. That means it will be some media or medium, so that enables the computers to read and write. Then what do you mean by this read and write? So let me tell you one thing. So read and write the information to the hard disk drive. So consider here we have a CPU. So there we have what? ALU part and CU part. Along with that, there we have registers, right? So in CPU, there will be a computation part, right? And it also able to hold the data. That means which is further required for the processing. And then what I have? Memory. So memory is nothing but what? In order to store the data. So why we require this hard disk controller? It will going to have a control over the data transfer between the computer system and this hard disk device or hard disk drive. So consider this as hard disk controller. So it acts as an interface that enables the computer, that is nothing but CPU, to read and write. Then what do you mean by this read and write? So read is nothing but a transfer of data from CPU to hard disk drive. That is nothing but what? Read function. I am going to read the content of memory or CPU to the hard disk drive. Okay, so the data can be either in CPU or in the memory. So then what is write? Write in the sense I am going to transfer the content of hard disk drive into the CPU or for the memory. So I am going to transfer the content of this hard disk drive to the CPU or to the memory. That is known as what? Write. So this hard disk controller have a control over the data transfer between the CPU. That is the data transfer in the sense what? Read and write operations. That will have a control over read and write. What are all the data that must be transferred from CPU to hard disk drive, or what are all the contents or data which must be transferred from hard disk drive to CPU or memory. That is regarding the first point. So this connector is mainly used to insert an IDE, that is Integrated Digital Electronic Cable. So in order to include this IDE cable into our computer system, then we require this hard disk controller. So coming to the third point here, the first standard hard disk controller is what? IDE standard drive. So this is the first hard disk controller which is developed, and this is also known as ATA, that is Advanced Technology Attachment. So this IDE standard drive has also another name, that is known as what? ATA, that is Advanced Technology Attachment. So coming to the next point, it is attached to the motherboard by 40 wire ribbon cable. How I am able to connect this hard disk controller to the computer system? With the help of this 40 wire ribbon cable. So this hard disk controller is attached to the motherboard with the help of this 40 wire ribbon cable, and it allows two drives to connect in a daisy chain fashion. So if I have that 40 wire cables, then that means this hard disk controller allows us two drives. So we can connect two drives in a daisy chain fashion. So coming to this last point, so that is EIDE, Enhanced IDE, Enhanced this Integrated Digital Electronics Cable. So with help of this EIDE, that is enhanced version of the IDE. So with the help of this IDE, I can attach two drives, right? So but with the help of this EIDE, that is enhanced IDE, I can allow or I can insert 4 drives to be connected to the motherboard. So that will be in the dual channel controller. With the help of IDE, I can connect two kinds of or two drives which can be connected to the motherboard in the fashion of daisy chain manner. But with the help of this EIDE, that is enhanced IDE, so I can connect or it allows 4 drives to be connected to the dual channel controller. So at last, this IDE cables connect devices. Then what are all the devices that I can connect with the help of this IDE cable? So that is CD drives, DVD drives and hard drives. So if I want to connect hard drives, CD drives or DVD, then I must use this IDE cable. It acts as what? Controller. I hope you got this point. So HDC is nothing but hard disk controller. It acts as an interface in order to transfer the data between CPU and the hard disk drives. So that is nothing but what? It will going to have a control over read and write operations. So read is nothing but what? I am going to read the content of a CPU or memory to the hard disk drive. So then write is nothing but what? I am going to fetch the details, or I am going to transfer the detail which is resides on the hard disk drive, that will be transferred to CPU or a memory. That is known as what? Write operation. So here first IDE or first hard disk controller which was manufactured is IDE cable, and it is also known as ATA, Advanced Technology Attachment. There that can be connected to motherboard with a 40 wire cable, a ribbon cable. And EIDE, that is Enhanced IDE, so that help us to allow us to connect a 4 drives into the motherboard. If it is IDE, then we are able to connect what? 2 drives into the motherboard. It's all regarding hard disk controller. So further I will move on to floppy disk controller. So floppy disk controller, in order to control the data transfer between the floppy disk drive to the CPU. Okay, that is the slight difference between the HDC and FDC. So now we'll see the points regarding this hard disk controller. It acts as an interface. So here also this floppy disk controller will act as an interface. So between what? So it will going to direct and controls a reading from and writing to the computer's floppy disk drive. So coming to this floppy disk drive, consider there will be some data and instruction, or there will be some files or any other information that could be stored in this floppy disk drive. But what if I want to fetch the data? So consider here we have a CPU, then memory. So as you all know that memory is mainly used to store the data, right? And CPU is used for processing. And this FDC performs the data transmission in direct access mode. That you have to keep it in mind. So direct memory access in the sense there is no intervention of the CPU. If I want to transfer the data from CPU to floppy disk drive, or if I want to transfer the content of floppy disk drive to CPU, there is no intervention of the microprocessor or CPU. That is known as what? Direct memory access. So here there will be no CPU. So there is no CPU transformation, or no CPU will be going to have an interaction with the floppy disk drive. So reading in the sense what? I am going to fetch the content which is resides in the memory to this floppy disk drive. Write in the sense I am going to communicate, or I am going to transfer the content from floppy disk drive to the memory. There will be no intervention of the CPU in between. That's why this floppy disk controller or floppy disk drive have a DMA, mode of data transfer. That is direct memory access. Whatever the content is there in the memory, that will be fetched directly. But in hard disk, I need to communicate with the CPU. CPU will going to control, or CPU will going to interact with the memory. Then it will transfer to CPU. Then from that CPU, I need to copy the data to the hard disk drive. But that is not in the case of floppy disk drive. So this floppy disk supports 33 wire ribbon cable. So this floppy disk controller supports or allows 33 wire ribbon cable, and we can connect up to 4 floppy disk drives to the motherboard. So in HDC there will be 40 wire ribbon cable, right? So that with the help of this IDE and EIDE, so we can connect 2 drives or 4 drives. But in this floppy disk drive, with the help of this 33 wire ribbon cable, we can connect up to 4 floppy disk drives to the motherboard. It is all regarding the floppy disk controller. So let me recap today's session. So in this session, we had a discussion regarding slots and what? Disk controller. Okay, slots are important for 3 marks and disk controller is also important for 3 marks question. Yes, it's all about today's session. By next session, I'm going to continue with the further components of a motherboard. Okay, until that, keep learning, keep on growing. Thank you.